"This is what happens when you disobey me," my father said, standing over a fire he'd built from everything I owned, while holding a garden hose to protect his lawn, my clothes, my sketchbooks, my grandmother's handmade quilt, 3 winters of her stitching, gone in 4 minutes. I was 17. I watched the smoke rise and said nothing. 6 years later, I called him. He picked up on the first ring. I said 2 words. What he found in his mailbox that evening changed everything, but not in the way he expected. Before I go on, please like and subscribe if this story speaks to you. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. My name is Bethany. I'm 23. Now let me take you back to Dayton, Ohio. The fall I turned 17, the week my father found my college application. The house at 4892 Ridgewood Drive was a 3-bedroom ranch on a 1/4-acre lot in a suburb where every other mailbox had an American flag sticker and every driveway held at least one pickup truck. My father, Gerald Thornton, had re-shingled the roof himself, poured the concrete patio himself, and bolted a brass house number plaque beside the front door that he polished every spring like it was a medal he'd earned in combat. To him, that house wasn't shelter. It was proof. Proof he'd made something. Proof he was somebody. Proof he was in charge. And inside it, he was. Dinner was at 6 sharp. I cooked. I washed. My older brother Garrett sat at the table and ate and left his plate for me without a word, because that was simply how things worked in our house. Gerald sat at the head, remote in hand. The television only ever played what he chose, and if the food was late, or the chicken was dry, the silence at that table turned into something with weight, something that pressed down on your shoulders until you couldn't swallow. Gerald kept every important document locked in a steel filing cabinet in the garage: my birth certificate, my social security card, my immunization records. I had never held my own ID. When I once asked for my social security number, I needed it for a part-time job application at the coffee shop on Route 48. He copied 9 digits onto a sticky note, watched me memorize them, and took the note back. In the living room sat his lazy boy recliner, oxblood leather, cracked at the armrests. Nobody sat in it. Nobody touched it. It faced the television like a throne facing a court, and every evening Gerald lowered himself into it with the authority of a man who believed the whole house orbited his comfort. It did. My brother Garrett was 22 when I was 17. Gerald had paid his community college tuition, a 1.5 years of classes Garrett mostly skipped before dropping out, without a single lecture about gratitude. Now Gerald was drawing up plans to set Garrett up with his own auto repair shop. Father and son spent weekends pricing hydraulic lifts and floor jacks the way some families planned vacations. I graduated in the top 10 of my class. My art teacher, Mrs. Rourke, pinned one of my charcoal portraits in the front hallway display case. My math scores were high enough that the guidance counselor printed a list of colleges and slid it across her desk to me with a hopeful look. I brought that list home folded inside my textbook. After dinner, plates cleared, I set it on the table in front of Gerald. He didn't pick it up. "College," he said, not as a question. "For what?" "Business," I said, "or accounting." He leaned back. "A girl goes to college, gets a degree, then gets married, and the degree sits in a drawer. You want to owe $50,000 for a piece of paper in a drawer?" Patricia, my mother, stood at the sink, her hands paused on a dish. She didn't turn around. "I could get financial aid," I said. "You could get a job and contribute to this household," he said, "like you're supposed to." I was already working weekends at the coffee shop on Route 48, $8.75 an hour, every dollar direct deposited into an account Gerald had opened in both our names. I never saw a bank statement. I didn't have an ATM card. My labor went in, and Gerald decided what came out. Garrett's future was an investment. Mine was an expense. But every Tuesday and Thursday after school, I stayed at the library. Gerald thought I was shelving books for volunteer credit. I was not. When I was 14, Gerald slammed his palm on the dinner table so hard the water glasses jumped. I don't remember what I'd done. Probably spoken without being spoken to. Probably breathed too loudly. probably existed in a way that reminded him he wasn't the only person in the room. He leaned across the table and shouted 3 inches from my face until his spit hit my cheek. The next morning, I told my school counselor. A woman from Child Protective Services knocked on our door 4 days later. She wore a lanyard and a patient smile. She looked around the house. Clean, stocked refrigerator, no bruises, took notes, asked questions. Gerald was calm and polite the entire visit, the way a man is calm and polite when he knows what's at stake. Nothing came of it, but Gerald never forgot. From that day forward, I became the girl who called the cops on her own father. Gerald made sure every aunt, uncle, and cousin knew it. Thanksgiving dinners, Easter brunches, 4th of July cookouts. He'd work it into conversation like a man picking a scab. Beth here once brought CPS to our house. 14 years old, can you imagine? I kept a roof over her head and she thanked me with a caseworker in my living room. Relatives stopped calling me. Invitations thinned. I became the difficult one, the problem, the cautionary tale of what happens when a daughter doesn't know her place. And whenever I pushed back on anything, curfew, chores, the money Gerald took, he had one line that ended every argument. You want to call the cops again? Go ahead. See who believes you this time. One night, just the 2 of us in the kitchen, my mother whispered, "Don't provoke him, Beth." Her hands were shaking around a coffee mug. She wasn't defending him. She was surviving him. And somewhere inside her arithmetic of fear, keeping me quiet meant keeping us both intact. On the living room wall hung a framed family portrait. Gerald, Patricia, Garrett, smiling at a JCPenney studio. I wasn't in it. Gerald told relatives I'd been busy that day. The truth was simpler. He never asked me to come. My grandmother, my mother's mother, died the spring I turned 15. Ovarian cancer. Diagnosed late. She spent her last 2 months at home in a recliner that looked nothing like Gerald's, surrounded by baskets of fabric and a sewing machine that hummed late into the night. The quilt she left me was a patchwork of cotton scraps from clothes we'd both worn, a sleeve from my 4th grade field trip shirt, a hem from the dress she wore to my kindergarten graduation, pieces of old flannel nightgowns and hand-me-down blouses layered and stitched into something that held warmth the way only handmade things can. She'd tucked lavender sachets into the seams. 2 years after her death, I could still smell them. Every night I pulled that quilt up to my chin and felt, for 10 seconds, like I belonged to someone who was glad I existed. My grandmother was the only adult who ever said to me, plainly, "You're sharp with numbers, Bethany. You have to go to school. Promise me." I promised. And so, on those Tuesday, Thursday afternoons at the school library, I wasn't volunteering. I was sitting at a public computer, pulling up the Sinclair Community College admissions page and filling out an application, one field at a time, saving my progress, clearing the browser history before I logged off. I used the school's address for correspondence. I listed Mrs. Rourke as a reference. I wrote my personal essay about the quilt, about someone building something beautiful out of scraps, about patience as a form of love. I didn't tell a soul. What I didn't know was that Gerald had set up parental notifications on the school's network system, something he'd demanded after the CPS visit, framed as keeping tabs on her internet usage. Every week, the system flagged activity categories and emailed a summary to the parent on file. The week I accessed college application resources 4 times, Gerald got an alert. I came home on a Thursday evening and knew something was wrong before I reached the kitchen. The television was off. Gerald sat in the lazy boy, but he wasn't reclined. He was upright, both feet flat on the carpet, hands resting on the armrests like a man about to deliver a verdict. The house was silent in a way that silence shouldn't be. Loaded, pressurized, the kind of quiet that makes your eardrums hum. "Sit down," he said. I sat on the couch across from him. My backpack was still on. I could feel the zipper pressing into my spine. "I got an email from the school," he said. His voice was low and steady, which was worse than yelling. Yelling meant the storm had already arrived. This voice meant it was still building. "College application resources. 4 visits this week. My mouth went dry. You want to explain that? I was looking into... behind my back. He cut me off without raising his volume. You sat in that library and applied to college behind my back. After I told you no. After I explained why. I just wanted to see if I could... You snuck around. Just like you did when you were 14. He let the CPS reference land. It always landed. You call the authorities on your own father. You go behind my back to do the one thing I told you we couldn't afford. Same pattern. Liar. Sneak. Patricia stood at the kitchen sink. I could hear the faucet running, though she'd stopped washing anything. Her hands were motionless in the water. Gerald stood up. The lazy boy rocked once behind him. He walked to the garage. I heard the filing cabinet open, the jingle of keys. When he came back, he was holding a heavy-duty black trash bag and his ring of house keys. He looked at me and said one word. Outside. He went to my room first. I followed him up the stairs because I didn't know what else to do, because my body hadn't yet caught up with the understanding that what was happening was actually happening. Gerald yanked open my closet and started pulling. Shirts, jeans, the second-hand winter coat I'd bought at Goodwill with my own tips. He stuffed them into the trash bag the way a man bags leaves in autumn. Mechanical, thorough, no hesitation. My sketchbooks went next. 3 years of charcoal portraits, still lifes, the drawing Mrs. Rourke had displayed in the school hallway. He bent them in half to fit. Then the books. Algebra 2. A P. English. A used copy of Pride and Prejudice I'd found at a yard sale for 50 cents. Garrett stood in the hallway, arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe. He watched the way someone watches a car accident. Fascinated, removed. He didn't say a word, didn't reach out a hand, didn't step forward. He simply observed his sister's life being shoved into a garbage bag, and then he looked at his phone. My mother appeared behind Garrett. Her face was white. "Gerald, please." "Shut your mouth," he said without turning around, "or yours is next." Patricia stepped back. She pressed herself against the hallway wall and stayed there, one hand covering her lips. Gerald pulled the quilt off my bed. Something electric shot through my chest. "Not that," I said. My voice cracked for the first and last time. "Please. That's from Grandma." He held the quilt balled up in both hands and looked at me the way a man looks at something he's about to prove a point with. "Your grandmother spoiled you," he said. "Look where that got us." He carried everything downstairs, through the kitchen, out the back door. I followed, and when I saw the burn barrel already standing in the center of the yard, the old steel drum he used for brush in the spring, positioned and waiting, I understood. He'd planned this. The barrel was already there. Gerald upended the trash bag into the barrel. My clothes, my books, my sketchbooks, they tumbled in like they were nothing. He reached for the plastic bottle of lighter fluid on the patio table. He'd set that out too. He doused everything. The chemical smell cut through the October air. Then he pulled a long-reach lighter from his shirt pocket, clicked it once, and held the flame to the edge of a cotton shirt. The fire caught fast. I stood 6 feet away and watched 17 years of belongings curl and blacken inside a steel drum in my father's backyard. Pages of sketches folded into ash. Fabric shrank and split. The lighter fluid made the flames jump high enough that I felt the heat on my forearms. Then he dropped the quilt in. Patchwork cotton, my grandmother's careful squares, the lavender sachets, the soft flannel from nightgowns I'd worn at 7 and 10 and 12. Caught at one corner and spread inward. The colors tightened, then disappeared. The whole thing was gone in under 4 minutes. Gerald held the garden hose in his other hand. Not for my things. For his lawn, in case the sparks drifted. Next door, I saw Mrs. Ruth Delano standing on her back porch. She was 70 years old, white-haired, both hands pressed to her mouth. She was watching through the chain-link fence, and she didn't look away. Gerald turned to me. He raised his voice, not for my benefit, but for the neighborhood. "This is what happens when you disobey me." I stared at the smoke. It rose in a thin gray line above the rooftops and vanished into a sky that was too blue to care. I said nothing. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I'd already said my last word in that house. He thought he was teaching me a lesson. He was right. Just not the one he intended. That night, I lay on a bare mattress in a room that smelled like lighter fluid and regret. No quilt, no sketchbooks on the desk, no winter coat in the closet. Gerald had locked the front door at 9 like he always did. The deadbolt he'd installed himself, keyed from both sides, so nobody left without his permission. Around 11, my bedroom door opened. No knock, no light. Patricia slipped in and sat on the edge of the mattress. She didn't speak right away. I could hear her breathing, shallow, careful, the way you breathe when you're trying not to exist too loudly in a house that punishes sound. She pressed a white envelope into my hand. I opened it by the glow of the streetlight through the blinds. Inside, my birth certificate, my social security card, and a thin fold of cash. $340 in 20s and 10s. Money she'd been skimming from grocery budgets over months, maybe years, hiding it in places Gerald would never look because Gerald never helped with groceries. "Go," she whispered. "Don't come back. I'm sorry, Beth." She squeezed my hand once. Then she stood up and walked out of my room and closed the door without turning around, because if she turned around she would cry. And if she cried, Gerald would hear. And if Gerald heard, the envelope would disappear into the filing cabinet, and this one narrow window would seal shut forever. I waited 15 minutes. Then I pushed open my bedroom window. Ground floor, thank God. Swung my legs over the sill and dropped 3 feet into the side yard. I was wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and sneakers. Nothing else. I walked to Mrs. Delano's house. 3 minutes. The porch light was on. I knocked twice. She opened the door, looked at my face, and pulled me inside without asking a single question. I left 4,892 Ridgewood Drive with $340 and a white envelope. I didn't know that 6 years later I'd stand in front of that same house holding a deed with my name on it. Gerald discovered I was gone by 6:15 the next morning, when nobody was in the kitchen making breakfast. He did not look for me. Instead, he picked up the phone and began calling family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, the entire network of Thornton's and Patricia's side too, and delivered a version of events so polished you'd think he'd rehearsed it. She ran off, middle of the night. No note, no explanation. After everything I've done, the roof, the food, the clothes, some kids are just born ungrateful. You remember the CPS thing? Same girl, same pattern. The narrative took root immediately because Gerald had spent 3 years fertilizing the soil. The relatives who'd already filed me under difficult now upgraded me to lost cause. Nobody called me. Nobody asked Patricia for my side. Nobody drove around looking for a 17-year-old girl who'd left home in October with no coat. By the afternoon, Gerald had cleared my bedroom. Mrs. Delano, watching from her kitchen window, told me later that she saw him carry out a bookshelf, a small desk, and a floor lamp. Within 48 hours, the room held a weight bench, a standing mirror, and rubber floor mats. Garrett's new home gym. 17 years of my existence, painted over in a weekend. Gerald also called the school, told them I'd transferred to live with relatives. The secretary logged it without follow-up. My guidance counselor, the one who'd printed that college list, never got the chance to ask where I'd gone. Mrs. Delano sat me at her kitchen table that first morning, pushed a plate of scrambled eggs toward me, and said, "Eat first, then we'll figure out what comes next." She pulled a phone book from a drawer and found the number for the Montgomery County Youth Services Shelter. She drove me there herself in her Buick, and she didn't cry until after she'd pulled away from the curb. That shelter became my address. A bunk bed, fluorescent lights, a 10 o'clock curfew, and 3 other girls who were each carrying their own version of the same story. The shelter smelled like industrial cleaner and microwave popcorn. The mattresses were vinyl. The showers ran lukewarm for exactly 7 minutes before the timer cut them off. I shared a room with 3 other girls, Danielle, who slept in her shoes, Mackenzie, who talked in her sleep about someone named Kyle, and a girl everyone called Birdie, who never told us her real name and left after 2 weeks without saying goodbye. A social worker named Mr. Foss helped me open a bank account in my own name for the first time in my life. I sat across from a teller at a Chase branch and slid my birth certificate and social security card across the counter. The same documents Patricia had pressed into my hand in the dark. And when the teller asked for a deposit, I put in $200 from Gerald's $340 and kept the rest as cash for bus fare and food. Mr. Foss also helped me enroll in GED prep, since I'd been pulled from school before finishing my junior year. And he flagged me for Medicaid, which meant I could fill a prescription for the inhaler I'd needed since childhood, but Gerald never consistently filled because he considered asthma a mindset problem. I got a job within the week. Cashier at a gas station convenience store on 3rd Street, night shift, $9.50 an hour. I stood behind a bulletproof partition and scanned energy drinks and lottery tickets from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. and walked back to the shelter in the gray pre-dawn light. I kept Patricia's envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket at all times. Not for the money. That was mostly spent. For the proof that she'd tried. That she'd loved me in the only way Gerald's house allowed. The first thing I bought with my own paycheck was a pair of sneakers from the clearance rack at Walmart. $12, white with a blue stripe. I laced them up in the parking lot and stood on the asphalt and felt, for the first time in months, like I was standing on ground that was actually mine. Have you ever had a moment like that, where something small, something cheap, made you feel like you were finally allowed to exist? I used to lie on that bunk at the shelter and wonder, why did wanting an education count as disobedience? Why was ambition betrayal? If you grew up in a house where your dreams were treated as disrespect, you know exactly what I mean. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. I passed my GED 4 months later, scored in the 92nd percentile in math. My grandmother would have been proud. At 18, I enrolled at Sinclair Community College, the same school I'd been secretly applying to when Gerald found me out. The irony sat in my chest like a stone. Financial aid covered most of the tuition. My convenience store wages covered the rest. Barely. I moved out of the shelter and into a shared apartment with 2 other students. A 1-bedroom that we split 3 ways, sleeping in shifts because one of us always had a night class. Business administration. I chose it because my grandmother told me I was sharp with numbers, and because I understood, in a way I couldn't yet articulate, that money was the architecture underneath everything Gerald had built and everything he'd used against me. If I was going to stop being controlled, I needed to understand the machinery of control. 300 miles of interstate and a different area code separated me from Ridgewood Drive, but Dayton has a way of pulling you back through rumor. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 2 years sent me a Facebook message. Your dad took out a loan on the house. Something about Garrett's shop. I looked it up. Public Records, Montgomery County Recorder's Office. Gerald had taken out a home equity line of credit, $85,000, secured against 4892 Ridgewood Drive. The funds were dispersed the same month a new business entity registered with the state. Thornton and Son Auto Repair, LLC, and Son, not and daughter, not and family. One afternoon, my bus route to campus passed through the commercial strip on Linden Avenue, and there it was. A freshly painted sign with blue background and yellow block letters. Thornton and Son Auto, mounted on a building Gerald had leased, with money borrowed against the only thing of value he owned. $85,000 on his son's dream. $340 is what my mother could scrape together for mine. The year I turned 20, I almost quit. I was working 2 jobs, the convenience store and a weekend housekeeping shift at a Comfort Inn off of Pine 75, while carrying 15 credit hours at Sinclair. My alarm went off at 5:30 every morning, and some nights I didn't get to sleep until 1. I ate ramen and peanut butter sandwiches and free continental breakfast leftovers that the hotel let staff take home in styrofoam containers. I nearly failed accounting 201. Not because I didn't understand debits and credits, but because I fell asleep during the midterm. Actually fell asleep, pen in hand, face on the desk, and woke up with 20 minutes left and a test half blank. And then came the message from a cousin a screenshot of something Gerald had posted on Facebook. I didn't have him as a friend, but the family network is porous in small-town Ohio. Gerald's post read, "Sad to say my daughter chose the streets over family. I tried my best. Some people don't want to be helped. Pray for her." Below it, 11 comments. Relatives expressing sympathy for Gerald. One aunt wrote, "You did everything you could, Ger. She'll learn the hard way. Nobody asked me. Nobody checked." That night, after my housekeeping shift, I sat on the bus at 11 p.m., forehead against the cold window, and I cried for the first time since the fire. Not loud, not dramatic, just tears running into the collar of a uniform polo that smelled like bleach and someone else's hotel room. For about 10 minutes, I wondered whether Gerald was right, whether I was wasting my time, whether the world was just a series of rooms controlled by men like him and I'd never find one that was mine. Then I remembered my grandmother's hands, the quilt, the stitching. 3 winters of patience. "You're sharp with numbers, Bethany. You have to go to school." I wiped my face with my sleeve. I got off at my stop. I walked home. And the next morning, I retook the exam and passed. I finished my associate's degree the semester I turned 21. Not with honors, not with fanfare, just a diploma in a cardboard folder and the quiet knowledge that nobody had handed me a single credit. The degree led to a job at a title company called Howell and Dean on East 5th Street. Entry level. $15 an hour. My job was to organize closing documents, verify property records, and process title searches. The unglamorous paperwork behind every real estate transaction in the greater Dayton area. Stacks of deeds, lien releases, mortgage assignments, and foreclosure filings passed through my hands every day. I learned to read them the way a mechanic reads engine codes, quickly, precisely, looking for the thing that didn't belong. The office was small. 4 desks, a copier that jammed twice a week, fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency only I seemed to hear. But it was mine. My desk. My name on the mailbox. My paychecks deposited into an account no one else could touch. Linda Marsh was a broker who worked out of the suite next door. She was 45, silver-streaked hair pinned in a low twist, and she wore reading glasses on a chain that she swung like a lasso when she was thinking. She started noticing me because I was always the last one in the building. One evening she leaned through the doorway and said, "You're still here." "I like reading the filings," I said, which was true. She looked at me over her glasses. "You're smarter than half the agents I've hired. Why aren't you licensed?" "Working on it," I said, which wasn't true yet, but became true the moment she said it. Linda began mentoring me. Over coffee, over lunch, over stacks of comp analyses. She taught me how to read a neighborhood, how to calculate equity, how to spot a distressed property before it hit the courthouse steps. "In real estate," she told me once, "paper is power. Whoever holds the deed holds the truth." I wrote that on a sticky note and put it on my desk. It stayed there for 2 years. I passed the Ohio real estate licensing exam on my first attempt, 3 weeks after my 22nd birthday. Linda hired me as a junior agent at her brokerage the same afternoon. I was making commission now. Not much at first, but enough that I moved into a studio apartment where I didn't have to sleep in shifts, and enough that I started putting money into a savings account I checked every Sunday morning with something close to disbelief. Meanwhile, 600 miles of hard work separated me from 4,892 Ridgewood Drive. But public records don't care about distance. Through my title company contacts, I had access to the same county databases I'd used every day at Howell and Dean. I wasn't searching for Gerald. I didn't need to. When you work in real estate in Montgomery County, information about every property, every lien, every default, every transfer, flows across your desk like water. You don't have to go looking. It finds you. And what it told me was this. Thornton and Son Auto was bleeding money. Garrett had hired too many people, spent too much on a renovation nobody asked for, and was pulling from the business account for personal expenses. A lease on a Dodge Charger, weekend trips to Put-in Bay with his girlfriend. The shop had been open less than 2 years and was already operating at a loss. Gerald, rather than confronting his golden child, doubled down. He took out a cash-out refinance on the house, rolling the original mortgage and the HELOC into a single new loan that pushed his total debt on 4892 Ridgewood past what the house was worth. On paper, he was underwater. In his mind, he was saving the family legacy. One evening, driving home from a showing, I passed the Linden Avenue commercial strip. The Thornton and Son auto sign still glowed, but 2 of its LED bulbs had burned out. The T and the O were dark. The sign now read, HRN on and Son AUO. It was the kind of detail a novelist would invent. But it was real, and I saw it, and I kept driving. The phone call came on a Sunday morning, 6 months before everything changed. I didn't recognize the number. I almost didn't answer. I was reviewing comps for a listing appointment, but something made me swipe. Beth? I hadn't heard my mother's voice in 4 years. It was thinner than I remembered, stretched tight like a wire carrying too much current. Mom. I'm calling from Ruth's phone. Mrs. Delano. Of course. Patricia didn't have a phone Gerald couldn't check. Ruth gave me your number a long time ago. I didn't know if you'd pick up. I picked up. Silence. Then. Your father is under a lot of stress, Beth. The shop isn't doing well. He's drinking more. Garrett doesn't come around much anymore. She wasn't asking me for money. She wasn't asking me to come back. She was just talking. The way a person talks when they've been holding their breath inside a sealed room and someone finally cracks a window. Are you okay, Mom? A pause. I'm the same. Which meant, no. Mom. You can leave, you know. There are resources. I can help you find. I'm fine, Beth. I just wanted to hear your voice. We talked for 8 more minutes. She asked what I was doing. I told her I worked in real estate. She said, your grandmother would be so proud. And her voice broke, and she recovered. And we both pretended it hadn't happened. After I hung up, I sat on my apartment floor for 10 minutes, staring at the wall. I thought about calling Gerald. I didn't. I thought about calling Garrett. I didn't. I thought about driving to Dayton and knocking on the front door of 4892 Ridgewood and saying, what? What would I say to a man who burned my things and slept fine that night? Nothing. There was nothing to say. 3 months later, I was sitting at my desk scrolling through the weekly foreclosure list published by the Montgomery County Recorder's Office, a task I did routinely as part of my work, looking for investment opportunities for Linda's clients. And a familiar address stopped my hand on the mouse. 4892 Ridgewood Drive. Notice of default. Bank of Dayton, N.A. Scheduled auction date, 60 days. I read the address 3 times, then a 4th. Then I pushed back from my desk and stared at the ceiling for a full minute, breathing through my mouth like a swimmer surfacing after too long underwater. 4892 Ridgewood Drive. 3-bedroom ranch, brass house numbers, lazy boy in the living room, burn barrel in the backyard. The notice of default meant Gerald had missed payments for at least 90 consecutive days. The bank had filed with the county. A notice of sale would follow, and then the house would go to auction on the courthouse steps, open to any bidder with a cashier's check and a pulse. Gerald Thornton, the man who had built his entire identity around that house, who had polished the brass numbers every spring, who had re-shingled the roof with his own hands, who had told me at least 100 times that his house meant his rules, had borrowed against it until the bank decided it wasn't his anymore. I pulled the full record. The HELOC from 3 years ago, $85,000. The cash-out refinance from 2 years ago, another 60 on top. Total debt secured against a house worth maybe $185,000 on a good day. Gerald hadn't made a mortgage payment in 6 months. The bank had followed every required step. Notice of default, right to cure, notice of sale. And Gerald had done nothing. No payment, no negotiation, no short sale. Either he didn't understand the paperwork, or he was too proud to ask for help, or both. I closed the browser tab. I opened it again, I closed it. I went to the break room and poured a cup of coffee and stood by the window. I remembered the fire, the quilt, the lighter fluid, the garden hose he held to protect his lawn. My house. My rules. Not anymore, I said out loud, to no one. Then I went back to my desk and pulled up the auction calendar. I told Linda before I told anyone else. We were sitting in her office, a corner room with a window overlooking a strip mall parking lot, which sounds depressing, but Linda had filled with potted ferns and framed photos of her closings, and it felt more like a greenhouse than a workplace. I need your advice, I said, not as my broker, as someone I trust. She set down her reading glasses. Go. There's a property going to auction in Montgomery County. 3-bed ranch, 1/4 acre. Needs a new roof and some plumbing work, but the structure's solid. Market comp in that neighborhood is about $185. Auction estimate is probably $120 to $140. Linda tilted her head. That's a decent margin. What's the catch? It's my father's house. She looked at me for a long time. The ferns swayed in the air from the vent above us. Then she asked the question I needed her to ask. Is this a business decision or a personal one? Both, I said. Then let me ask you this. If this were any house, owned by any stranger, at that price point, in that zip code, would you buy it? I'd already run the numbers. Purchase at auction, roughly $130. Closing costs and title fees, maybe $4,000. Estimated repairs. Roof, water heater, some updated plumbing, $15,000 to $20,000. All-in cost, around $155. Market value after repairs, $185 to $190. 30+ thousand in built equity from day one. Yes, I said. I'd buy it. Then you already have your answer. She paused. But Bethany, make sure you're buying a house, not buying a fight. I'm buying a house, I said. If it also happens to be the house where my father burned everything I owned, that's his problem, not mine. Linda looked at me over her glasses. Then she nodded once, slowly, the way she did when a deal made sense to her. I'll help you with the pre-approval, she said. I didn't go looking for this, but I wasn't going to look away either. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing the way Linda had taught me, the same way I'd prepare for any investment property, with the same spreadsheets and the same due diligence, because if this was going to work, it had to be clean. I ran the title search myself. The deed was in Gerald's name alone. Patricia was not on the title. A decision Gerald had made when they bought the house 24 years ago, claiming it simplified things. What it actually simplified was control. If the house was only in his name, Patricia had no say in what happened to it. She couldn't sell it, refinance it, or prevent him from borrowing against it. She was a guest in her own home and always had been. I verified the liens, the original mortgage, the HELOC, the cash-out refinance, all secured by the property, all in default. I confirmed the auction date, the location, Montgomery County Common Pleas Court, and the deposit requirement, a cashier's check for 10% of the opening bid, due at the time of sale. I got pre-approved for an investment property loan through a local credit union Linda had worked with for years. Combined with my savings, 4 years of commission checks, gas station shifts, hotel housekeeping wages, every dollar I'd earned since the day I climbed out of that bedroom window. I had enough for the deposit, and then some. The night before the auction, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my apartment floor with a mug of tea, and the only photograph I still owned from my old life, a Polaroid of my grandmother holding me at age 5, taken at a church picnic. I was laughing. She was looking down at me like I was the only good thing in the frame. I tucked the photo back into my wallet and set my alarm for 6 a.m. Tomorrow, I would stand on the steps of the Montgomery County Courthouse and bid on the house where my father had told me I was nothing. The cashier's check in my bag was for $14,000, 10% of the opening bid. It represented 6 years of labor, 6 years of silence, and 6 years of becoming someone Gerald Thornton never imagined I could be. The Montgomery County Courthouse smelled like floor wax and old paper. The auction was held in a room on the second floor. Linoleum, folding chairs, a podium at the front, and about 20 people sat in clusters, most of them investors or attorneys. I was the only woman under 30. The auctioneer worked through properties in order: a duplex on Wayne Avenue, a vacant lot near Riverside, an apartment building on Salem with a tax lien dispute. Each one drawn out in legalese and then resolved in 60 seconds of raised paddles and monotone bids. Then, Lot 7, 4,892 Ridgewood Drive, single-family residential, 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath, quarter-acre lot, foreclosure sale, opening bid set by the line holder at $119,000. My chest tightened. I held my paddle flat against my thigh. 2 other bidders raised immediately: a man in a golf shirt who looked like he bought houses the way some people buy scratch-offs, and a woman with a clipboard who represented some regional investment group. 119, 122, 125. The golf shirt man dropped out at 128. The clipboard woman pushed to 130. I raised my paddle. 131. The clipboard woman looked at me, then at her spreadsheet, then shook her head. The auctioneer waited. Silence in the room like a held breath. Sold. $131,000. Bidder number 7. I walked to the clerk's table and signed. The pen was cheap. Blue ballpoint courthouse issue, the kind that costs 12 cents in bulk. But when I wrote Bethany Thornton on the purchase agreement, my hand was steady. The clerk glanced at the name, then at the name on the foreclosure filing. Thornton and Thornton. She looked up at me. I looked back. She stamped the document without comment. Gerald had let every opportunity to save the house pass. Every cure period, every negotiation window, every chance to sell before the bank took over. He was too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit the shop had failed, too convinced that 4,892 Ridgewood Drive would always be his because he'd decided it would always be his. But decisions don't override defaults, and defaults don't care about pride. The deed was recorded 17 days later at the Montgomery County Recorder's Office. I picked up the certified copy on a Tuesday afternoon, and I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot and held it in both hands. Deed of conveyance. Grantee Bethany M. Thornton. My name. My house. The following Saturday, I drove to Ridgewood Drive. I hadn't been on that street in 6 years. The neighborhood looked the same: mowed lawns, American flag mailboxes, pickup trucks in driveways, but smaller, somehow. The way places from childhood always shrink when you return as an adult carrying different measurements. I parked across the street from 4892. The brass house numbers were tarnished. Gerald hadn't polished them. The patio concrete he'd poured himself had a long crack running through it. The lawn was mowed, though. Of course it was. Gerald would let the roof rot before he'd let the grass grow past 2 inches. He was outside, in fact, pushing a mower in straight lines, wearing the same flannel shirt he'd worn the day he burned my things. He didn't see me. I got out of my car. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the house. His house. My house. And I asked a woman walking her dog to take my photograph. She smiled and obliged. In the photo, I'm standing in front of the brass numbers, 4892 visible over my left shoulder. My expression is calm. Not smiling. Not angry. Just present. I printed the photo at a CVS. On the back, I wrote in neat block letters: new owner, deed recorded date. Montgomery County Recorder's Office, B. Thornton. I slid it into a white envelope. No name on the outside, just like the one my mother had given me. I drove to Ridgewood Drive one more time, opened the mailbox at the curb, placed the envelope inside, raised the red flag, and drove away. I waited one day. I wanted him to find the envelope first, to hold the photograph, to read the back, to feel the floor shift, before he heard my voice. Sunday afternoon, 4:17 p.m. I was sitting in my apartment at the kitchen table, hands folded, phone in front of me. I picked it up and dialed the number I'd never deleted. It rang once. One ring. That's all it took. Bethany? His voice was different, older, rougher at the edges like sandpaper that's been used too many times. But there was something else in it. Something I hadn't expected. He sounded like a man who had been waiting by the phone but would never admit it. A man who had kept his daughter's number saved for 6 years without calling because calling would mean the silence was his fault, and admitting fault was the one thing Gerald Thornton could not do. "Check your mailbox," I said. Then I hung up. I set the phone on the table and stared at it for a long time. My heart was pounding in a way that surprised me. Not from anger, not from triumph, but from the strange, vertiginous feeling of completing a circuit that had been open for 6 years. He'd picked up on the first ring. He could have let it go to voicemail. He could have waited 3 rings, 4, 5. Long enough to pretend he wasn't eager. Long enough to reassemble the Gerald who didn't need anyone. But he hadn't. He'd picked up the phone like a man reaching for something he was afraid would disappear. I didn't know what he'd do next. I didn't know if he'd rage or cry, or drive to my office, or sit on the porch in silence. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. For the first time in his life, Gerald Thornton was going to open a piece of mail and discover that his daughter owned the roof over his head. I wasn't there when he opened it. What I know, I learned later. From Mrs. Delano, who was sitting on her porch with a glass of iced tea and a direct sightline to Gerald's mailbox, because Ruth Delano was 74 years old and had earned the right to observe her neighborhood without apology. She told me Gerald walked to the curb about 20 minutes after my call. He was still holding his flip phone. He opened the mailbox, pulled out the white envelope, and turned it over in his hands. No name. No return address. He tore it open standing in the driveway. He looked at the photograph. Ruth said he went very still. The kind of still that only happens when the body is processing something the mind hasn't caught up with yet. He stared at the front. Then he flipped it over and read the back. Ruth said his hand dropped to his side. The envelope fluttered to the pavement. He sat down on the front porch steps, the same porch where he used to sit with a Budweiser and survey his domain. And he did not move for 40 minutes. He didn't call Patricia. He didn't shout. He didn't go inside. He just sat there holding the photograph in one hand and his phone in the other, staring at the lawn he'd mowed that morning, the lawn that now belonged to his 23-year-old daughter. Ruth told me he called me back. 3 times. I didn't answer. He sat there like a man who'd just been told his own house didn't know his name anymore. Ruth said to me later over the phone, in her quiet, steady voice. I said nothing. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked. I thought about it. Actually thought about it. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." For 6 years, Gerald had controlled who got to speak and who had to stay silent. Now the silence was his, and I was the one who'd chosen not to fill it. 2 days later, Gerald walked into the offices of Marsh & Associates Realty at 10:15 on a Tuesday morning. I was at my desk, second cup of coffee, reviewing a listing agreement for a property on Huffman Avenue. Linda was in her office with the door open. 2 other agents, Mark and Denise, were at their desks. A client couple sat in the waiting area flipping through a home search binder. The door opened and Gerald stepped in like he was entering a courtroom. Flannel shirt, work jeans with a grease stain on the left knee, ball cap that read Thornton and Son Auto, the logo of a business that had closed 3 months ago. He looked older, thinner in the face, heavier under the eyes, but his posture was the same, rigid, commanding. The posture of a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. He scanned the office and found me. "Bethany." I looked up from my desk. My nameplate was facing him. Bethany Thornton, licensed agent. "Gerald," I said. "Not Dad." "Not anymore." He crossed the room in 4 strides. "You think this is funny? You think you can take my house?" I set down my pen. "It stopped being your house when you stopped paying the mortgage 6 months ago. The bank filed for foreclosure. The auction was public. Anyone with financing could bid. I had financing. I bid. I won. It's all recorded at the county recorder's office. That is my house." His voice cracked upward. Mark and Denise stopped typing. The client couple in the waiting area looked up. "I built that patio. I reshingled that roof." And then you borrowed against it until there was nothing left, I said. I kept my voice level. You took out an $85,000 HELOC for Garrett's shop. Then a cash-out refinance for 60 more. The shop failed. The payments stopped. The bank followed procedure. This isn't something I did to you, Gerald. This is something that happened because of choices you made. He stood there, breathing hard, fists at his sides. The room was silent in the way rooms go silent when everyone is pretending not to watch. Linda stepped out of her office. She was calm the way a woman who has brokered 1,200 transactions is calm, unshakable, measured, with the kind of authority that doesn't need volume. Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your voice. This is a place of business. Gerald swung toward her. You don't know this girl. She called CPS on her own father when she was 14 years old. That's who you hired. Linda didn't blink. She looked at me. I looked back. I reported my school counselor, I said, because you screamed in my face at the dinner table. CPS came because they were supposed to come. You weren't charged with anything. But you made sure every relative I had knew about it, and you used it to isolate me for 3 years. So let's be accurate about what happened, Gerald. The client couple was staring openly now. Denise had her hand frozen over her keyboard. Mark had quietly pulled out his phone, not recording, just holding it, like a reflex. Gerald's face reddened. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. I raised you, he said. His voice was quieter now, but the edge was still there. I fed you. I gave you a roof. And this is what I get? You burned everything I owned in the backyard, I said. My clothes, my books, my grandmother's quilt. You stood there with a garden hose to protect your lawn and let 6 years of my life turn to ash. And then you told the whole family I was ungrateful. I paused. Every person in that office was listening. You don't get to destroy someone's belongings and then complain when you lose yours, through your own choices. Gerald stared at me. I could see the machinery behind his eyes grinding, trying to find the angle, the leverage, the word that would flip this back to a reality he controlled. But there was no angle. There was no leverage. The deed was recorded. The auction was legal. The numbers were public. You have 30 days, I said. Standard eviction timeline under Ohio law. I won't shorten it. I won't extend it. 30 days. He stood in the middle of the office surrounded by people who now knew exactly who he was, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. He walked out without closing the door. You know, standing there in that office, watching him leave, I realized something I hadn't expected. He still didn't understand. He still thought the house was about power. His power. He never considered that I didn't buy it to take something from him. I bought it because I could. Because 6 years ago, I couldn't buy a bus ticket. And now I could buy a house. The house just happened to be his. But here's what I keep turning over in my mind. Is there a difference between justice and revenge when the person never sees the line? What do you think? Does it matter what you call it? Or does it only matter what it costs you? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know. Garrett called me 4 days later. It was the first time I'd heard his voice since I was 17. Beth? He sounded like a man standing in a room where everything was on fire and he'd just realized the exit was locked. I know we haven't. It's been... Look, Dad needs somewhere to go. He's got 30 days, right? He told me. He does. Okay. So, here's the thing. A pause so long I could hear him swallow. I don't really have room. Kelly and I are in a 1-bedroom in Columbus. It's tight. I can't take him. Garrett, I said. He mortgaged the house for your shop? $85,000? He refinanced for another $60,000 to keep it afloat when it started failing. You know that, right? Silence. He bet everything on you, I said. Everything. The house. His credit. His retirement. He put it all into Thornton and Son Auto. And when the shop went under, you moved to Columbus. I didn't ask him to. Did you pay him back? More silence. The answer was in the silence. Beth, I'm not the bad guy here. I didn't say you were, but I'm not the solution either. You had 22 years of his support. I had 17 years of his control. He gave you a business. He gave me a burn barrel. And now you're calling me the one he threw out to fix what the one he chose couldn't hold together. His breathing was ragged. I'm not selling the house, I said. And I'm not letting him live there rent-free. That's not my responsibility. If you want to help your father, help him. But you don't get to hand that job to me. I hung up, and I sat there thinking about the sign, Thornton and Son Auto, and how the whole family's money and faith had gone into 2 words on a marquee. And when the marquee went dark, the son kept driving. He bet everything on his son. His son left him on red. Gerald moved out on day 27. No phone call. No forwarding address. Mrs. Delano told me she saw him loading a pickup truck. A borrowed one, not Garrett's. With boxes, a duffel bag, and the lazy boy recliner. He drove to a cousin's house on the other side of Dayton. The throne came with him. The kingdom didn't. I waited a week. Then I drove to 4892 Ridgewood with a locksmith, a contractor, and a chest full of feelings I hadn't sorted yet. The house was dimmer than I remembered. Gerald had left it in rough shape. Stained carpet, a dripping kitchen faucet, a living room that smelled like Budweiser and old newspaper. But the bones were solid. The walls were straight. The foundation hadn't cracked, even if the man living on top of it had. I walked through every room, making notes for the contractor. New roof, water heater, update the plumbing in the hall bath, repaint. It was a project, not a miracle. The kind of house I'd learned to see potential in because Linda taught me to look past the surface. Then I reached the back bedroom. My old room, the one Gerald had turned into Garrett's gym. The weight bench was gone. The mirror was gone. But in the corner, behind a sliding closet door, there was a shelf Gerald apparently hadn't bothered clearing because he assumed it was empty. It wasn't. I found a Nike shoebox, crushed and dusty. I pulled off the lid. Inside, 3 pages torn from a sketchbook, edges blackened and curled. A charcoal drawing of a woman's hands, my grandmother's hands, drawn from memory when I was 16. 2 more sketches beneath it, half destroyed. And at the bottom, folded into a small square, a piece of fabric, patchwork cotton, singed at the edges, faded lavender scent, barely there, a single square from the quilt. Gerald had gone into the ashes. After the fire had died and I'd gone to my room and the neighborhood had turned out its lights, he had reached into that burn barrel and pulled these things out. He'd kept them in a shoebox on a shelf in a closet for 6 years. He never told me. He never used them to apologize. He just kept them, the way he kept my phone number, silently, privately, uselessly. I held the square of fabric and sat on the bare floor of my old bedroom and felt something I couldn't name. Not forgiveness, not anger, something in between. Like finding a handprint in cement from someone who broke your window. It didn't change what he did. But it changed the shape of what I remembered. From a man who only knew how to destroy, to a man who also knew how to regret, but chose the wrong way to carry it. Every single time. Patricia called me 3 days after I changed the locks. Her voice was different. I noticed it immediately. Not the thin wire tension I'd heard 6 months ago, but something closer to clear water. Still cautious, still quiet, but present in a way she hadn't been in years. "He's staying at Dale's," she said. Dale was Gerald's cousin, a house on the west side with a pull-out couch and no questions. "He took the recliner and 3 boxes, that's all." "And you?" I asked. "I'm still at the house." A pause. "Your house." Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. "Beth, do you want me to leave?" I leaned against my kitchen counter and closed my eyes. I saw her in the dark 6 years ago, sliding an envelope into my hand. $340, a birth certificate, a social security card. The entire fortune of a woman who had spent 24 years under a roof she didn't own. married to a man who treated silence as consent and obedience as love. "Do you want to stay?" I asked. She started to cry. Not the stifled, one hand over the mouth crying she'd learned in Gerald's house. Real crying, the kind that takes up space, the kind a person makes when they realize they've been given a door. "Yes," she said. "Please." "Then stay. 200 a month. Enough to cover utilities and give you dignity. I'm not giving you charity, Mom. I'm giving you a lease." 200, she repeated. "I'm fixing the roof next month. The plumber comes Thursday. And Mom..." I paused. "His name's not on anything anymore. Not the deed, not the mailbox, not the rules." She cried again. But this time it was the kind of crying you do when a weight lifts and your body doesn't know how to be that light yet. "I should have done more, Beth. I know that." "You gave me the envelope, Mom. That was enough to start." That night, for the first time in 24 years, Patricia Thornton slept in a house where the front door was unlocked because the person who owned the deadbolt was her daughter, and her daughter believed in doors that open from the inside. I spent the next 4 weekends at 4892 Ridgewood with a toolbox, a contractor named Eddie who owed Linda a favor, and a stubbornness I apparently inherited from the one person I least wanted to resemble. We tore off the old shingles and laid new ones, charcoal gray instead of Gerald's faded brown. I chose the color myself, standing in the Lowe's paint aisle for 20 minutes, running my fingers over sample cards. I repainted the exterior. Soft white with slate blue trim, a palette so different from Gerald's beige and brown that the house looked like a completely different structure from the street. Which was the point. The brass house numbers stayed. I cleaned them, though. They deserved better than neglect. Inside, Patricia and I pulled up the stained carpet together and discovered hardwood floors underneath that Gerald had covered when they moved in because he didn't like the sound of footsteps. We sanded them and sealed them, and the house filled with the smell of polyurethane and new beginnings, which are not the same scent but arrive in the same season. I converted the back bedroom, the gym, the closet, the room that had once been mine, back into a bedroom. New paint, new curtains. And on the wall, in a simple oak frame behind glass, I hung the square of quilt fabric I'd found in the shoebox, singed edges and faded lavender, preserved. Mrs. Delano came over one Sunday with a flat of marigolds and 2 bags of potting soil. We knelt in the backyard together, in the same spot where the burn barrel had stood, and we planted flowers. Gold and orange, the kind that come back every year without being asked. "He burned things in this yard," I said. Ruth pressed soil around a seedling and smiled. "And you planted them." Gerald called in October, 5 months after the auction. 1 month after the marigolds bloomed. I was sitting on the front porch, my front porch, drinking coffee and watching the neighborhood settle into the kind of early evening stillness that makes Ohio suburbs feel like paintings. The trees on Ridgewood Drive were turning. Mrs. Delano waved from her yard. Patricia was inside, watching television. Whatever she wanted, as loud as she wanted. My phone buzzed. Gerald's number. I looked at it for 3 rings. Then I answered. "Bethany." His voice was gravel and distance. "Gerald." A pause so long I could hear a dog barking 2 streets over. "You were always stubborn," he said. "I was always determined," I said. "You called it stubborn because it didn't serve you." Another pause. I could hear him breathing. The heavy, labored breath of a 56-year-old man whose pride had cost him everything and whose lungs weren't what they used to be. "How's your mother?" he asked. It was the first time he'd asked about Patricia in a conversation with me. Not my wife. Not her. Your mother. "She's good," I said. "She's at Ridgewood. She's safe." He didn't respond to that. I don't know if he could. "Gerald," I said, "I'm not going to pretend that what you did was okay. The fire, the isolation, the way you erased me from the family. I'm not going to pretend any of that didn't happen." I paused. "But I'm not going to punish you forever either. I won't make it easy. But I won't seal the door." "So what is this?" he asked. "This is a conversation," I said. That's all it is right now. He was quiet for a long time. Okay, he said, and hung up. I set the phone down on the porch railing and picked up my coffee. The sky was amber and darkening. Somewhere inside, Patricia laughed at something on the television, a sound I hadn't heard from her in years, maybe ever. And the windows glowed with a warmth that had nothing to do with the thermostat. He lost this house the same way he lost me, by refusing to believe we could leave. I'm sitting on the porch again as I tell you this. Morning this time. Early, before the neighborhood wakes up. Coffee in a mug I bought at a thrift store, the kind with a chipped handle and a faded floral print that reminds me of fabric in a quilt. The lawn is mine. The roof is mine. The brass numbers that read 4892 catch the sunrise. And they're polished now, because some things deserve care even when the person who installed them didn't know how to give it. I didn't buy this house to get revenge. I bought it because it was a sound investment, because I had the knowledge and the capital and the license to make the decision, and because 6 years ago I was a 17-year-old girl standing in this yard with nothing, watching everything I'd owned turn to smoke, and I'd promised myself, silently, without witnesses, that I would build something from the ashes. I just didn't know the something would be this literal. If there's a lesson, it's not the one you'd expect. It's not, work hard and you'll show them. It's not, the best revenge is success. It's simpler and harder than that. My grandmother stitched that quilt over 3 winters. She cut fabric, chose patterns, threaded needles, and sat in a recliner night after night, making something that held warmth, because she wanted me to be warm. It took patience. It took hands. It took time she didn't know she was running out of. I lost everything and built it back in 6 years. Both were made by hand. If you're in your first year, the year where everything is ash and you're standing in a yard with nothing, I want you to know that is not the end. But nobody is going to carry you out. You have to climb through the window yourself. The envelope helps, but the walking is yours. That's my story. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know. If someone in your life needs to hear this, send them this video. And if you want more stories about people who rebuilt from nothing, there's a link in the description. Subscribe if you haven't. I'll see you in the next one.